looks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Well, how do you know when you found the right person for a job? How do you know if you found the right person to spend the rest of your life with? How do you know if you found the right person to trust your kids with? How do you know? Well, you look for certain characteristics, right? I mean, if it's a job and you're trying to find the right person, you look at the references. You call the references. You want to make sure they are the right person. And if it's a romantic relationship, you go on a few dates. You want to get to know the person. You want to figure out who they are. And if it's seeing if the person is the right person to leave your kids with, then you go to their pantry and you make sure they have enough snacks. I'm just kidding. But the duck philosophy, it's easy when it's applied to ducks, but then it gets complicated when it comes to people. Because people can be strangely deceptive, showing the side they want you to see and hiding the side they don't like. Well, how do you know when it comes to Christians? How do you know if a person that you're talking to in the checkout line at Walmart, the person you work with, the person you sit next to you, how do you know if they're a Christian? How do you know if they are a believer in Jesus? I mean, what do you look for? I don't know about you. I try to be discreet about this, because as soon as somebody finds out that I'm a pastor, one of two things happens. Usually that's the end of the conversation and they're checked out. They're trying to get away from me as quick as possible. Or I kind of get buttered up about how amazing they are. They're Christians and they are the best human being on planet Earth. And so you just start dropping words to see how they're going to respond, test the waters. And so I ask, how's your day? And it's good. How's your day? And I'm just kind of testing the waters, seeing where they're at. I'll say, it's good. Can't complain. I'm blessed. See how they respond. If it's kind of neutral or maybe positive, I may even add a second word. I may say, God's been good. God's been good. And I just kind of test the water, see how they respond to what I say, and on it goes. And we try to pick up cues from people to see who they are, to see how they are. And we do this with virtually everything in life. But what are those cues for Christians? I mean, what is the equivalent? They walk like a duck, quack like a duck, and look like a duck for a Christian. Well, let me tell you an embarrassing story about me that happened my first year of being a Christian. This was my junior year of high school. I was really excited about my faith. I was really excited about Jesus. I was really excited about learning God's Word. And I had heard people talk about this thing called the Ten Commandments, which I assumed was very important and helpful to guide my life. And so I thought, well, if people talk a lot about these, they must be important, so I should learn them and I should memorize them. And so I thought really hard about what I could do in order to do that. And I thought maybe the most helpful thing I can do is to commit this to memory, so that and put it in a place that I can constantly look at it and remember it and just draw that back to mind. And then I had this brilliant idea. I can write it on an index card and then tape it to the front of my hat. My thought was, this will help me memorize the Ten Commandments. It will be a great conversation piece that will kind of spark, and it will let people know I'm a Christian. And to this day, I blush with telling that story. But is that what it amounts to showing we're Christians? Wear Christian clothes, listen to Christian music, hang out with Christian people, get Christian bumper stickers, like the one with the big fish eating the smaller fish. Eating at the Christian chicken, Chick-fil-A. Like, is that what it amounts to? How do you know? Like when you're in the store, at the restaurant, you're at work, you're in school, how do you know if someone is a Christian or not? Or better yet, how do you know who the really spiritual ones are? How do you know? How do you know when somebody is they're really close with God? Well, if you lived in the first century and you asked this question, they would have given you three answers. they would have said giving, prayer, and fasting. These are the characteristics of a really spiritual person. They would have thought that the really spiritual people, they're the ones who are giving to the poor. Those who have these beautiful and personal prayers, those who fast regularly, those are the spiritual giants among us. They are those who are considerate of the needs around them and are giving. They're the ones who are praying with eloquence, and they fast with such regularity that obviously God is involved in their life. God is answering their prayers, and He's attentive. But there's a problem with this. Many people who are doing this in Jesus' day, things like giving and prayer and fasting, they're doing it not out of sincerity, but because they want to persuade people that they are spiritual. And here's how Jesus frames this up in Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 1. He says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people, in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." Jesus begins with a word of caution about practicing these things to be seen by others. And 3 times in this teaching, Jesus tells us to not to do this for recognition from others, rather to do these things in secret. Matthew 6, starting in verse 3. He says, "Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you." And it's important to know what Jesus means by the word secret, because I think oftentimes when we hear secret, we hear deception and we hear corruption. Why else would somebody want to keep something a secret if they were worried about somebody else knowing? And so we have this kind of this suspicion that bleeds into this word. And it's important to know that that's not what Jesus means. The word that Jesus uses here is a Greek word, kruptos, which simply means something is hidden from view. It is kept from the public's attention. The public eye, it cannot see this. It's a word that describes something with regards to being seen is actually unseen. Matthew 6:6. He says this, "When you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret," or who is unseen. "And your Father who sees in secret," or in the unseen, He'll reward you. Verse 18. "That your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in the unseen. And your Father who sees in the unseen will reward you." And so it's pretty clear what Jesus is saying here. He's saying this, and here's the key idea today. He's saying this: engage God with private devotion. Engage God with private devotion, not public attention. Don't be religious. Don't do spiritual things so that people will see you as religious, so that people will see you as spiritual. But what about what Jesus said earlier in Matthew chapter 5? Because it kind of sounds like Jesus is contradicting himself. Matthew chapter 5, verse 14. Jesus says this. He says, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden." That's the same word for secret, same word for hidden in Matthew chapter 6. Jesus is saying his disciples, they cannot remain unseen. They cannot remain secret, hidden from the public. Contrary, Jesus says we're to do the opposite. "Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Hold on a second, right? 1 minute, Jesus says, let your good works shine. Let them be public. Let people see them. And then the next minute, Jesus says, don't. Don't let people see your good work. Don't let people see your righteousness. In fact, they're supposed to be unseen and secretive. what in the world is Jesus doing? I mean, is Jesus contradicting himself here? Well, to understand what Jesus means by this seen, unseen thing, we have got to understand the bigger picture of what Jesus is doing in Matthew chapter 5 and 6. In chapter 5, Jesus is addressing inward character. Inward character. This is the motive of the heart, the inward posture of our heart, rather than these outward actions. So he speaks against things like the heart issues on anger and lust and breaking promises and retaliation and hating your enemy. His point is that our inward character as a disciple, it must look different than the inward character of those in the world. One that is characterized with loving others in practical ways, like keeping your promises, keeping covenants, doing good to those who do wrong to you, honoring the dignity of others by not lusting after them. And those inward characteristics, they shine brightly. People notice when you are not overcome with anger, but with kindness. People notice that. People notice when you are considerate and you are concerned for others, especially when they have no concern for you. People see this. They notice this. They take recognition of that. Jesus' focus in chapter 5 is about inward character. In chapter 6, Jesus turns from inward character to talk about outward expression. Outward expression. This is our devotion to God. These are the things that by their very nature, they are external. They are outward. They are demonstrable expressions of our faith in God and our love toward others. These are not per se things about our character, but they certainly reveal our character. These are things like prayer and serving and giving and fasting. The focus here is not about making sure that everything we do is completely stored away and hidden from others, that nobody sees absolutely anything of what we do in our devotion. That's not what Jesus is saying. Rather, his focus is that when we do things like prayer and fasting, etc., it is that we are to do that with an audience of one. That's the motive. Our focus is to do it for an audience of one, and that is God. God is our focus. Now, so what are the outward expressions? Well, the first thing that Jesus talks about in verses 2 through 4 is giving to the poor, what ancient authors called almsgiving. Almsgiving. It's giving assistance, it's giving food, it's giving resources, it's giving money in order to help those who are poor. And this was a big ministry in the early church, and it was even a big part of the Jewish world. In fact, after 70 A.D., the Jerusalem temple, it was demolished, it was destroyed. This was the hub of worship. All the Jews would flock to the temple to offer sacrifices and worship to God. And after 70 A.D., the temple is destroyed, and the rabbis saw giving to the poor as the equivalent, as replacing, in a sense, sacrifice. And in the early church, from its beginning, they would sell their property so that they can have some financial reserve so that they can help the poor among their own community. But they didn't just focus on themselves, they really focused on anybody in and around them. In fact, in the 4th century, a pagan priest by the name Julian, he tried with all of his might to run Christians out of Rome. And he wanted to take Christianity and he wanted to expel it out of the empire. So Christianity was nowhere to be found in the Roman Empire. And as he is doing this, as he's going around trying to run Christians out, run Christianity out, and restore it back to its pagan roots, he notices something very interesting about the Christians. And here is what he says. He says, these impious Galileans, Christians, they not only feed their own poor, other Christians, but ours also. That is the pagan homeless non-Christians. Welcoming them into their agape, that's a reference to their community-wide meals called the agape meal. They would have these huge meals, inviting all to come and just enjoy these meals. They attract them as children are attracted with cakes. That when a kid sees candy, they flock to these things. And he's saying, look, these meals, these gatherings they're having, those who are poor, those who are homeless, they are just flocking to these things in masses. That these are attractive, these are drawing people. And to me, this is a profound piece of writing, not coming from a Christian, but coming from somebody who is currently trying to dismantle Christianity. Powerful. And Jesus points out that giving to the poor is one of the key ways of showing our devotion to God. Serving those who are less fortunate, serving those who are destitute, Jesus tells us is an act of worship to God. And it's why as a church we do things like Manna Monday, where we serve a community hot meal once a month. It's why we as a church, we have a benevolent ministry where we can serve and help those within our church who have some financial barriers. It's why we, as a church, we support Christian organizations like Hearts United. It's not because this is the humanitarian thing to do. It's not because this is the right thing to do to people. It's also because we believe by doing those things, we are actually worshiping God through them. That God is glorified through those actions. And Thanksgiving's coming up this week, and something that we can do, something that has been deeply impactful for us is we've been like nomads everywhere we've lived. And so people have always been incredibly gracious to invite us to their table and invite us over to Thanksgiving. Maybe a generous act is to look around and see who around you doesn't have anywhere to go for Thanksgiving and inviting them over. The next thing Jesus mentions in verses 5 through 9 is prayer, which is an obvious way to express faith in God outwardly. And there are all kinds of reasons, and there's all kinds of goals to prayer, to praying. Prayer is just as diverse as having a conversation with a trusted friend or having a conversation with your spouse. And just as you could not narrow down one form of conversation with somebody you love or somebody you get along with, so it is with God. Sometimes when I have a conversation with Stephanie, I ask things from her. Sometimes I make requests. A lot of times we have conversations because we're just trying to get to know each other and learn, and we ask questions. Sometimes we have conversations because we need to work out a problem. We need to work out an issue. Sometimes we have conversations because we need to fix a mistake that we've made. We need to confess. We need to repent. We need to ask for forgiveness. And sometimes we have conversations just because we need to vent. Think of prayer like that. Think of prayer with a conversation with God like that. And just as diverse as our conversations with other people, so equally is the diversity with prayer and God. It's not just about making requests to God. It's also about repenting, venting, thanking, and even enjoying God's presence. And I'll leave a discussion for prayer and more in depth for next week, as the text is on the Lord's Prayer, and that will be unpacked. But the next thing that Jesus mentions is fasting. Fasting. And this was a common practice among believers really for every generation throughout church history. And it was so highly valued by believers in Jesus' day and by Jesus himself. In fact, Jesus practiced fasting often. This was a practice of his. This was a devotion of his. The common practice of fasting in the first century was the fast from dinner to dinner, where you abstain from eating food between those two periods of time. So in essence, you skipped breakfast and lunch. And I think for many Christians today, this is a practice that has kind of fallen out of relevance for us, which is interesting. It's interesting. Because it really hasn't for most of church history. Richard Foster, he wrote a classic book on spiritual disciplines for the Christian life, which is a highly recommended read. He said that not one book on fasting was published from the years 1861 to 1954, almost 100 years. There was not one book published on the subject, which is fascinating. Now, I can't speak for you, but I know from conversations that I have had with people and even looking into my own life, this is not something that's often practiced or taken very serious. And I think for many people, we have a negative view on this because we think, why fast? God hears me when I pray. I don't need to be good enough, do enough good. I don't need to do this religious thing of like not eating bacon in the morning. I don't need to twist God's arm for him to hear my prayers. But fasting is not just about what we're trying to get from God. It's not just about making a request from God. Sometimes we fast because we are trying to ask God to do something in our life, in our world, and so we fast over that. Sometimes we are asking God to do something in our world, in our country. Sometimes we fast because we are just broken about our sin. We are grieved by what sin has caused. Sometimes we fast because we are in the process of mourning a loss. We are grieving over something that has happened in our life or even in our world. And one of the things that many people have noticed about fasting is that when you fast, your raw root sins, your unhealthy habits, they seem to come out of the woodworks when you are hungry. They seem to meet you face to face, and you have this encounter with some of the deeper issues a part of your soul, where you now have this unique opportunity when you are devoting yourself to God to encounter those, to face those with God. And there's all kinds of reasons to fast, not just making a request. But here's the thing with each of these, with giving, with praying, with fasting. If you look and you notice, Jesus does not command us to do these. He doesn't say, I want you to do this. Here's how he says it. Verse 2. When you give to the needy. Verse 5. When you pray. Verse 16. When you fast. Jesus does not tell us to do these things. He just assumes that we are. He assumes this is just something that we do, which begs the question, if we are claiming Christ, if we are claiming to have a relationship with God, does our life show that? Does our life bear witness to a regular practice of having some kind of devotional life with God? Do we regularly give to the church? Are we regularly being generous with the poor and the needy? Are we regularly coming to God in prayer in the non-crisis situations? Are we seeking God to do something in our life through fasting? Are we grieving? Are we trying to confront the demons of our soul? Assuming that we are, Jesus moves in, I think, one of the most convicting directions. With each of these, he calls us to really deeply evaluate what our motives are when we do things like prayer, when we do things like fasting, when we do things like giving. Why do we do these things? Jesus says, when you give, assuming we are already generous, assuming we are already giving, he says, don't be like the hypocrites who announce it with this parade-like force. Now, most people, these quote-unquote hypocrites are walking around with coins in one hand and a trumpet in the other, that when they give, they blow the trumpet and they make this huge announcement. Most people don't think that Jesus is actually meaning that. The point is that Jesus is making is drawing at the motive behind their giving. They're trying to draw attention to themselves. They're trying to call everyone to look at how good they are. Look at how wonderful of a person they are. And so it's really this motivation of worrying about what others are thinking of you when you put a check in the offering plate. or you don't. It's this concern of what is somebody else going to think of me, and feeling a sense of obligation, so you do, so you give. Or it's walking past somebody that you see in need, and you see that they need help, but you kind of walk on by, and then you all of a sudden you run into another church member and you think, oh, I should go back and help them out because I don't want to be seen as a bad Christian. And I must confess, with all of these motives, man, I feel that lurking in the back of my heart, in the back of my mind. A silly example of this is that several months back, I was feeling rushed after service, and as I was kind of rushing out, I saw trash on the ground. And my first thought was, I don't have time to pick this up. And then I started kind of moving forward, and I thought, but what will someone think of me as their pastor if I don't pick that up? So I turned around and I picked it up and I threw it away. Jesus says, instead of giving, instead of serving because you are worried about what somebody else will think of you, don't be driven by that motive, or because you want others to think highly of you or speak highly of you. Do it in ways that will not draw attention to yourself or come from a motive to make yourself look better. Jesus uses the example of not letting your left hand know what your right hand is doing, and the idea is that we should not announce that not only should we not announce our actions to other people, but we shouldn't even announce it to ourselves, that we should keep that from ourselves, that we just see a need and we respond to it very quickly, and then we move on without that sort of self-congratulation speech that we give to ourselves and say, man, good job, you're an excellent person. Because that really quickly morphs into this sort of self-righteous attitude. We should just do good, not because it makes us feel better, but because we are truly grateful for God. We are grateful for the gift of life, for the gift of Jesus' death on the cross for us. We should do that as a response to what God has done for us. Next, he talks about prayer. And he uses two examples here. One involves those who offer some kind of public prayer, and those who sort of get in this repetitious, mechanical prayer where they say one word over and 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 over again, trying to somehow kind of twist and manipulate God to doing something. The hypocrites Jesus addresses are those who are so concerned about what people will think of them when they pray that they perform these prayers with this elaborate expressions and eloquence. It's a performance. And Jesus says, prayer is not about what somebody else will think of you when you pray out loud. That's not what prayer is about. Prayer is not about what people think of you. Prayer, by its very nature, is this intimate conversation with God where we can drop our guard and have an honest and open conversation with Him. And so Jesus says, when you pray, get back to the essence of prayer. Go to a private place and have an honest conversation with God. And there's nothing wrong with public prayer. There's nothing wrong with it at all. Jesus practiced public prayer. The church has historically prioritized public prayer, praying out loud together as a church. But if you have ever been in a group, small group, life group, Bible study, church, and you have been asked to pray publicly, you almost immediately feel a different atmosphere in prayer. You go from seeing prayer as this private conversation with God to making sure you don't sound like an idiot when you pray, right? There is a sense of restriction. There's a sense of hesitation. And that's part of what Jesus' point is. God doesn't want us to be so concerned with what other people will think of us when we pray that we never open up our heart to God and bear what's going on in our lives and how we think and what we actually feel. And these hypocrites, they use prayer as a way to show off just how spiritual they were. They were the ones they would be the ones that you would ask, hey, you should pray over the service. Hey, you should pray over the meal. Hey, we're having this gathering. Can you come by and can you pray over it? Can you pray over the events? I mean, people would have, they would have asked them, hey, can you have so-and-so pray? They are incredible prayer warriors. I mean, God, no doubt, He answers their prayers. I mean, do you hear how authentic? Do you hear how powerful? Do you hear how beautiful their prayers are? Next, he talks about fasting. He says the hypocrites, they make it unmistakable that they're fasting. They disfigure their faces and they look gloomy. They look ugly. They're having a bad hair day. They make it obvious something is going on with them. Maybe so that you would ask them, hey, what's going on? And then they can build up how holy they are. One commentator I read on this, he put it like this. And I want to read this. He says, Jesus invites us to imagine a scene where a shallow woman is preparing to fast. She doesn't want to boast openly about her fasting, but she thinks, if I look a little ragged, maybe somebody will ask why. So I won't wash my hair, I'll skip my makeup. No, better yet, I'll smear a little brown and gray under my eyes. And when she arrives at work, her friends notice at once, Lucy, they exclaim, what happened to you today? You look terrible. Are you all right? Oh, yes, Lucy slowly moans. I'm fine, but I'm a little hungry, I guess. Well, then we can go out and we can get something to eat. Oh, no. You see, I'm fasting. Lucy, you're so holy. Well, maybe. Doesn't that make you feel exposed? I know it does for me. Because in Lucy, I see so much of myself, and it makes me uncomfortable. It's painful. The hypocrites, they do spiritual things so you would notice how spiritual they are. They do these things so that they can draw attention to how biblical, to how holy, to how religious they are. And the scary thing is that it probably began with some relatively innocent motives. They probably saw their giving as an opportunity to set an example for others, for other believers. Maybe they saw their prayers as a sort of kind of teaching moment where they can shepherd and teach others how to pray. Or maybe they did spiritual things as fasting because they wanted to show others how to fast or how to have a devotional life. And so these innocent motives, they just kind of, it began with this purity, but then it began to morph. And a desire for people to not just notice an example, but to see them as something more. To see them as holy. To see them as important. To see them as someone who matters. Someone to pay attention to. Somebody who is worthy of praise. That they wanted to become the talk of the town, but for how good they are. And we've got to remember this key idea. We are called to engage God with private devotion. Private devotion, not public attention. This is what God wants. He wants private devotion, not public attention. That when the motive is to call attention to ourselves, when the motive is public attention, Jesus says, I want you to know that's your reward. That is what you offer. That is what you are after, so that is what you will get. But don't expect to get anything from me. And when the motive is private engagement with God, God rewards that to us. And 3 times, in fact, Jesus promises us a reward from God. Verses 4, 6, and 18. Jesus uses the same exact phrase. He says, when your desire in giving and praying and fasting is a private engagement with God and not a showy applause from people, your Father who sees in secret, He will reward you. What is the reward that God wants to give us? What is the reward that God wants to give you? To understand that, I think we have got to understand the deeper issue the deeper need that is driving these hypocrites that Jesus talks about. The two words that Jesus uses here get at the heart of this. Verse 2, Jesus says, that they may be praised by others. Verse 5, that they may be seen by others. Verse 16, that their fasting may be seen by others. Jesus says, what is standing behind the motives of their giving, of their praying, of their fasting, are two Greek words. The two Greek words are this: doxazo and pheno. Doxazo is a word that's used only in verse 2 here, and it means to be honored, to be honored. It is to enhance esteem. It's to enhance a reputation. Jesus says that these people are so desperate for being honored. They want people to kiss the ground on which they walk. They want to be thought well of, to be the topic of public praise. The other word Jesus uses here is pheno, which is a word that describes the shining of a bright light. It's the shining of a light. The translation here is the word seen. The idea behind this is to act in such a way it makes observation possible. We want to be seen, and so we make sure that we put on our best face, we put on our best clothes, we put on our best practice, we put on this best face so that we look super spiritual to those around us, that they would see how spiritual we are. And I think these two words, I think they're revealing, not just because they show us the motive of a hypocrite that allows us to do a diagnostic on our own soul and to go, okay, this is what I need to avoid, but I think these two words are revealing because I think they show us a core need that we have as humans, a deeper need that we are trying to meet that really can only be met by God. We as a people, we as humans, we desire honor. We desire recognition. The difference between the hypocrite and the disciple is who we try to get that from. Are we trying to get that from people, or are we trying to get that from God? Jesus says this in Matthew 10. So everyone who acknowledges me before men, I will also acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. Hebrews 6:10. For God is not unjust so as to overlook your work in the love that you have shown for His name in serving the saints as you still do. Paul says in Galatians 1, for am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I were still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. It is not an entirely bad thing to feel a desire to be honored for recognition. I think it's a human need. I think it gets back down to our own nature, to being made in God's own image. The difference between receiving that from people versus God comes down to this. When we are seeking to receive honor and recognition from people, what we really want is we want the glory, we want the attention that belongs only to God. But when we seek honor and recognition from God, it is not us seeking to get God to kind of pat us on the back and say, congratulations, you are a wonderful human being. It is rather we are trying, it is getting God to notice us. It is this intimate relationship with God. And God grants us our hearts, desires. God gives us what we want. The difference is, do we want to be noticed so we can be praised? Or do we want God to notice us in our praise? That's the difference. Our reward is God. That's our reward. What do we get? We get God. And God gives us the desires of our heart. And so if we want Him, then when we seek Him, He gives us Himself. But if our desire is to get the applause and the attention of others, God gives that to us. And that's the reward. And in the end, we have this beautiful promise that when our focus is Him, here's what God will say to us. Matthew 25. His master said to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant." I don't know if there is any greater statement of honor in history, in literature, than God saying to His broken creation, His sinful creation, the creation that broke things, that messed everything up in the beginning, "Well done." I don't know if there's a greater statement of honor. And it's why I think Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 4. "I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait until the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in the darkness and will expose the motives of the heart. At that time, each will receive their praise from God." So why are you here? Why do you gather together in church? Why do you sing songs? Why do you take communion? Why do you write a check and place it in the offering plate or put it in the special offering envelope? What is the motive that is driving those actions, those spiritual actions? Is it motivated for recognition from people? What are other people going to think of me? I want other people to think well of me. Or is it a motive to be recognized by God, to worship God through those things? Our reward is not that God will increase our bank account. That's not a reward. Our reward is not that God would grant us all of our hopes, all of our dreams, but that we as a people, when we humble ourselves before Him and we seek Him, He grants that to us. That when we humble ourselves and we seek Him with sincerity, God gives us Himself. He gives us what our hearts are desperately aching for, and that is Him, and that is more of Him. And this week, give and be generous. Give and be generous. Not so that others will notice you, but out of worship. This week, engage God in prayer and in fasting to be with Him. Engage God with private devotion. Private devotion, not public attention.